picking up in verse 16. Verse 16 of John 6. And here's what happens. It says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, Jesus' disciples. They went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the Sea of Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because of a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land to which they were going. All right, well, this morning we kind of pick up where we left off here in chapter 6 on our journey through John's Gospel. And this is yet another amazing miracle. It seems like last week we looked at an amazing miracle. Today we're looking at another miracle, actually a set of miracles that happened today. But if you remember, just to kind of set the stage so we understand what's happening and in context here, if you remember, Jesus and his 12 disciples, they were down in Jerusalem where Jesus had quite a confrontation with the religious leaders down there. And now they journeyed back up to the region of Galilee, which was kind of Jesus' home base in Capernaum. And as they come to the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias, they come to it in the southeast corner of the sea. Just to kind of give you the geography of what's happening. They're in the southeast corner, and they're going to sail across the sea. But instead of going diagonally, they go up the coast. So they cross the sea from the south to the north. So now they're in the northeast corner. And when they get to land in the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus gets out, and he starts to do some healings. And people begin to hear that Jesus is in the area, and they come from all over the place, and this crowd besets on Jesus here in this northeast region, and Jesus begins teaching them. And John notes one other thing as this crowd begins to gather that we looked at last week. He said, and it is around the time of the Passover. And it seems funny that John would mention that, but it's very important to understand chronologically what's happening here, because there's 3 Passovers that are mentioned during the ministry of Jesus. This is the second Passover that's mentioned. And if you remember, the third Passover that's mentioned, which we'll celebrate at communion today, was when Jesus returns to Jerusalem and has the Last Supper with the disciples and goes to the cross. So basically what's happening is it's 1 year left before Jesus goes to the cross. And this is important because time is getting short, and as Jesus is revealing himself, but even more than that, he's training his disciples to go out into the world, to continue the ministry, for after he resurrects and after he ascends back to heaven, they're going to continue this work and be his witnesses throughout the world. But in order to do that, they need to be strong. They need to be good followers. And Jesus is training them. And more than ever, he's got to get their faith strengthened. And this is why, when the crowds are coming to him and they need to eat, that he tests Philip. And he says, "Philip, where are you going to buy bread so that these people can eat?" Knowing all the while that Jesus was going to feed this huge crowd himself. Yet he did it to test Philip and to test his disciples where their faith was. Was it in themselves or was it in him? And as we find that what gets revealed is the disciples' faith is in themselves. And Philip says, "We can't do it. We don't have enough money." And then Andrew goes, "We don't have enough food. It's impossible." It's not impossible. It's possible with Jesus. So they still need to have their faith developed, or their belief and their trust in Jesus developed here. So Jesus shows his power to them, this power to provide as he multiplies the loaves and the fishes, feeds over 5,000 people with leftovers to spare. And as a result of this, the crowd suddenly realizes, this is the promised Messiah. This is him. And they seek to take him by force and make him king in earthly rule so that he can help deliver them from the Romans. This isn't why Jesus came. So in verse 15, right before our passage begins, it says that Jesus perceived that they wanted to do this, and he withdraws himself from them. So they don't do anything stupid, right? And so he can there doesn't have to be a confrontation. So he withdraws. And this is where our passage opens this morning. And it opens with another miracle that's just as amazing as this feeding of this huge crowd. And what we have to understand, though, is this miracle, it doesn't stand alone. of Jesus walking on the water. All of this with Jesus walking on the water is sandwiched between two important events. This miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Then right after this miracle, Jesus explains the significance of what he was doing in feeding the 5,000. So with John placing this event here and this event happening here, it relates. It all is tied together with what's happening. So how does it relate? Well, because Jesus is continuing to train his disciples. He's continuing to show them the importance of faith. Now, in addition to John's gospel, this miracle is also recorded in two other gospels. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 14 and Mark chapter 6. And both Matthew and Mark include a lot more details to this event than John includes. In fact, most notably, Matthew includes that it wasn't just Peter that walked on the water, Jesus that walked on the water, but Peter then says, if it's you, command me to get out and I'll walk to you. And Peter walks on the water. So Matthew's account includes that. John doesn't. Seems like it's a pretty important event. Why doesn't John include this? Well, yes, there is a lot we can learn from Peter walking on the water, but really, John includes what he includes in this. He strips it down like he does because he has a very specific purpose in writing, and that is so that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may find life in his name. And the lesson that's being taught here, John can do it by just sharing this miracle of Jesus walking on the water. So it's not that Peter is unimportant. It's not as necessary for what John is trying to do in revealing Jesus to us and revealing the purpose of Jesus. Because, again, he's writing this and he's sharing that he wants us to understand this important lesson that's going on through this miracle of walking on the water. For not only the disciples, but all who follow Jesus. We need to learn this lesson because it's around a subject matter that we all face. And this subject matter is that of fear. And before we dive into the passage and we learn how this all ties together, I want to talk a little bit about fear. Because fear is a pretty big subject matter, isn't it? Fear is pretty huge. In fact, fear can be a powerful motivator, can it? A lot of people say, this is why I'm motivated, is by fear. In fact, many people, the disciples, and even many people today, can be controlled by fear. Or we make decisions in our life, and we make decisions in relationships, and even we make decisions in our spiritual life based on fear. For example, rather than being motivated by a sense of stewardship and worship, we at school try really hard and we work really hard at school, or we work really hard at our job, motivated by fear because, well, if I don't work really hard, I might not get into college, or I might not get a job, or I need to keep my job so that I can provide for myself and provide for my family. So if I don't work hard, I'm afraid I won't be provided for. And that's why we work hard rather than in stewardship. In relationships, we put ourselves out there in relationships because we say, man, I better push myself to be liked and to be accepted because I'm afraid that I might be all alone. Or I'm afraid that people reject me, or that I won't have any value if people don't know me, or I might be overlooked. So I got to put myself out there even though I don't know how, and we kind of force ourselves to do this. Even in our spiritual lives, fear can be a powerful motivator for us. Many people obey God because we're afraid if I don't obey God, he's going to squash me. So that anytime we do something that disobeys God, we're like looking for the lightning bolt. And we're like, oh no, I did that. And we're afraid, so afraid to do something wrong because God might punish us. Or we go to church and we pray and we read our Bible, not to get closer to God, but because we fear that if we don't do those things, God won't answer our prayers, or God won't bless us. So we get in this performance cycle based on fear because we want God to work and we want God to be with us. And it even goes to the way we follow God and the way we share Jesus. We can be motivated by fear or controlled by fear in the way that maybe we don't speak up for Jesus or share Jesus with our friends because we're afraid they're going to reject us, or we don't stand up in our society against sin because we're afraid of being labeled or being put out there, so we don't do it. So we say, I don't want to stand up. And again, Whether it leads to positive or negative behaviors, fear can be a strong motivator. However, fear should not motivate or control us as followers of Jesus. Do you know that? Sure, there's a place for healthy fear in our life, and we should have healthy fear in things. We should have a healthy fear of God. We should look at him in all of his glory and his otherness, his holiness, and look at him with awe and reverence and that kind of fear. We should have a healthy fear when it comes to obeying laws in our society. You know, you're driving down the highway and you see a speed trap. We should have a healthy fear of saying, am I going the right speed? Why? Because we don't want to get a ticket, right? And that's a healthy fear. We should have a healthy fear when it comes to facing dangers in our lives. I mean, you stand on the edge of a cliff. We should have a healthy fear in respect of that if I take a step forward, I could be in trouble. We can have a healthy fear of things like spiders and snakes. We can have a healthy fear of certain things and a respect and a reverence of these things and not be controlled. You see, in trusting Jesus, we should not be controlled or act motivated by fear. Now, what does all of this have to do with Jesus walking on water? Well, our passage is so important because Jesus uses this miracle to shape his followers, his disciples' faith in the midst of a very scary situation. His disciples will need this. They will need to know not to be controlled by fear when they are sent out by Jesus into all the world to make disciples, because they're going to face a very scary world. We need to know that we're not controlled by fear as we every day face a very scary world as followers of Jesus, right? And we're not to be people that are controlled by fear. So this miracle is very important, and this passage is very important because through it we learn a very important lesson, and it's this, in a nutshell. Here's the passage. We don't need to be controlled by fear when our faith is in Jesus. We don't need to be controlled by fear when our faith is in Jesus. We can be free from fear's paralyzing grip on our life when we're trusting Jesus rather than ourselves or rather than others. And it's here in our passage we see this truth come to life, not only for the 12 disciples, but also for us as we seek to follow Jesus today. So what I want to do this morning is dive into our passage and look at how this comes through as John is communicating this lesson to us and why it's so important and how we can live lives that aren't controlled by fear, but rather faith. So we can have faith over fear. So look again at verse 16. So it's evening time on this day. Jesus had just fed the crowds and fed these over, some estimate 10 to 20,000 people with all of the leftovers, and now they're satisfied, and they may want to go and take Jesus, but then he withdraws so they don't see him. So what do? They decide, well, let's disperse. Let's go home. Right? That was quite a day. So the crowds begin to disperse and go back home as it's evening. And it says here that the disciples, they returned to their boat to set off again on their journey. Their end result is to get to Capernaum. Now, Capernaum is on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, along with Bethsaida. So they're on the northeast corner. So they're going to hug the coast, the north coast. In fact, when they sail across the sea, they're going to be sailing very close to shore, probably less than a mile or a half a mile from shore. So they're always going to be close to shore, but they go, and it's about a 7-mile journey across the Sea of Galilee to Capernaum. So they set out. Jesus wasn't with them. Again, Jesus wanted to be alone. Now, it's interesting. We find some interesting details in both Matthew and Mark about this, that it actually says, they indicate that Jesus made them get into the boat. In fact, if you read those accounts, it says Jesus made them. It's not that just the disciples said, hey, we're going to go get in the boat. The idea is that Jesus commanded them, which means they didn't really want to go in the boat by themselves. But they did because Jesus told them. Now, why didn't they want to get into the boat? Why did they want to stay with Jesus? Well, we're not told. It could be that they thought they needed to protect him from these crowds that might want to take him, so they need to be around for that. It could be they're fearful that the crowd may take Jesus and make him king, and they miss out on all of this glory. We're not told why they don't want to do this. We're just told that there's this idea that they didn't want to do it, so Jesus made them get into the boat and said, you guys get in the boat. And to their credit, they obey. They do a good thing, right? Jesus commands you to do something, you do something. And it's a good thing. They do what Jesus wanted them to do. And there's something very interesting that happens to this that I don't know about you, but when I read this, it gives me a little pause. It's like, well, wait a minute then. You say, even though they do the right thing, they still end up in trouble. That's not the way things are supposed to work, is it? I mean, I don't know about you, but in my thinking is if Jesus asked me to do something and I do it, things should go well. Isn't that what obeying Jesus is all about? We obey him and things go well for us. So why are they facing something scary? Because they obeyed Jesus. Why are they finding themselves in trouble? Because they obey Jesus. Now, we're not told that the disciples were sitting here thinking about this, but as I read this, I'm like, this is where I would be with this. I'd be like, I obeyed. Why would Jesus want us to do this? If we're going to go and we're going to face trouble. I mean, that's not the way following Jesus is supposed to work. You know, we should expect hardship. We should expect trouble in our life when we disobey or rebel against God, shouldn't we? We should expect things don't necessarily go the way they're supposed to go or the way that's comfortable for us. But when we obey Jesus, things should always be comfortable. Why would Jesus call them to do something that puts them in danger? Why would he tell the disciples to sail across the sea if they're going to face a huge storm? Well, herein lies a first lesson that helps us understand that truth about being controlled by fear rather than having your faith in Jesus. You see, fear should not control us because we first of all trust that Jesus knows what he's doing. You want to know one way that we can be free of fear's paralyzing grip? You know, one way that Jesus is shaping the disciples' faith over fear is he reminds them through this, he knows what he's doing. Again, John never reveals whether he or his fellow disciples questioned this or not, but one thing we know is that Jesus had a specific purpose. He had a reason for telling them to get in the boat and go to the other side. Again, nothing Jesus does is random. He does everything for a purpose. He knows what he's doing. And he had a plan in sending them off across the sea that night where they would face this storm. You know what his plan was? To build their faith. To show that it's not about themselves, relying on themselves. It's about relying on Jesus, who is bigger than anything they can possibly face. To show them where their trust should be rather than in themselves. So he had them do this to put them in a situation where faith collides with fear. You know, sometimes we can face things like this, can't we? Have you ever had that happen to you? You know, so again, sometimes we face troubles because we make poor decisions and we do poor actions. But you know, there's times where we face trouble in life, where we face difficult situations that are not a result of our doing, not a result of our disobedience. It's actually we're sitting there following God and we're doing everything right, yet we have to go through suffering. Doesn't seem fair, does it? Have you ever had that happen to you? Sometimes we face trials that seem unwarranted, even though we're doing things right. Well, what do I mean? Well, I remember when I was a single adult, and I was like, man, God, I know you have somebody for me. Why? I'm doing everything I should be doing. I'm following you. I'm going to church. I'm growing in my relationship with you. Why aren't you working? What am I doing wrong? Have you ever been there? And you're sitting and saying, well, why is this not happening? And we can get frustrated, and we can cry out, and we can be fearful. And so fearful that maybe we start to make it happen ourselves. Whereas God is having us wait, even though we're doing the right things, because he's waiting to give us the person he has for us, and they're not ready yet. Or maybe he wants to keep us from doing something dumb, or he wants to shape our faith. Or maybe you're facing trials at work, or maybe you face a health situation that just pops up out of the blue through no fault of your own, and all of a sudden you're like, how did this just happen to me? I did nothing for this. I've been healthy. Why is this happening to me? Trust Jesus. He knows what he's doing. You know, sometimes it's to bring us to a point where we're resting in him. Sometimes it's to bring us to a place where we get to share him with others that we would never get to share him with otherwise. He places us in a brand new mission field because we go through a trial or a trouble. And yet these are scary situations where he doesn't want us to be controlled by fear, but faith, knowing that he knows what he's doing. So if I'm going through this, he's going to work. Isn't that why Paul writes in Romans chapter 8? And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. You know the idea of love? Do you know what love is all about? It's about trust. So we can put that word in too. And for those who trust God, all things work together for good. And sometimes we look at that verse and we say, that's so trite sometimes. I mean, it just sounds something somebody throws at you to kind of pacify you. But when we really think about this, what is Jesus saying? What is Paul saying here? God knows what he's doing. And Jesus knows what he's doing with us. This is an important and powerful truth for our lives that we can rest in, to know if we're trusting God, then we're also trusting that he knows what he's doing. So if we're facing something that we didn't put ourselves in and it's happening to us, it's happening for a reason. And here, the disciples are facing this storm. Now, it's interesting, storms in the Sea of Galilee. Storms in the Sea of Galilee were very common. In fact, some of these disciples were very experienced on the Sea of Galilee as fishermen and sailors, and they knew what they were doing. But evening time at the Sea of Galilee was a very dangerous time. You see, the geography of the region is the Sea of Galilee sat 500 feet below sea level. And it was surrounded by mountains, some of them 2,500 feet high, surrounded them. And the region there, the climate in that region, it's not like here where it's 150% humidity all the time. I mean, it was low humidity, so the days would be warm, but the nights would get cool. And if you ever took science class, you know what happens with heat and cool, right? Cold air sinks, hot air rises. So as the air would cool in the evening time, the cool air would come across the mountains down into this sea. It would mix with that hot air, forcing that to rise, which would kick up the sea and kick up these winds, because the north end of the Sea of Galilee was where this delta was, where Bethsaida is. So the air would come rushing down that valley from north to south. And that's why it would kick up into this great storm. And it's interesting that it's blowing from north to south because the disciples are going along the north edge of the sea. So the wind is pushing them out further into the sea. And if we look at the timing of this, we see that Jesus comes to them at the fourth watch, which is about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. They set off in evening time, let's say 7 o'clock. That's usually evening, right? To make a 7 to 8 mile journey on a boat. Even if they're rowing slow, it should take them no more than 4 hours to get there. They're working on 8 hours at this point, and they've only gone 3 to 4 miles. Right? Look at verse 19. They rode 3 to 4 miles. That's it. They're struggling, and they're getting pushed further away from land, further away from their destination, more into danger, and they're not making any headway, no matter how much they're trying. They're not able to do this. This is the situation they're in, and it's taking much longer. And it's at this point, this fourth watch, as Matthew and Mark say, that Jesus comes walking to them on the water. And the word used for walking is actually, it carries with it the idea he's casually strolling. And why is that important? Because the seas are rough. Like you got 5-footer waves stacked on top of each other. And it's not that Jesus is like going against the wind and having to climb over these waves. He's just floating over. Hey guys. As easy as could be. Nothing that's happening is affecting him. The idea is that the disciples, they didn't do anything to deserve this, but Jesus brought them there. That Jesus was there with them, right? And no matter what they did. And nowhere do we see, the disciples necessarily were fearful of the storm, but they weren't getting anywhere. So they're fearful in the sense of, are we ever going to get in, right? and they were difficult and they were fighting. But it does say in the passage that they were afraid. What were they afraid of then? Well, John doesn't really tell us, but Matthew and Mark tell us. Here's what Mark says that they were afraid of. It says, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out. Do you know there's one thing about fear, when fear controls us? Fear makes us do some pretty irrational things. We can make some pretty dumb decisions and hasty decisions when we make them from fear, and we can think some very irrational thoughts. You know, there's times where I'm working here in the evening, especially in the winter when the heat's on, and I'll have all the lights off in the building because I don't want to pay for any electricity and don't want us to. So I'll be in my office and it'll be completely dark everywhere else in the building. And if you've ever been in this building at night, when the heat is on, you hear the pipes, right? And they go, ping, ping, ping. When you're here and it's dark, and I open up my office door and come into the sanctuary and it's pitch black and you hear, poof, poof, poof. You know what happens? You start seeing things and you start saying, am I going to do this? And I always turn on the light. I'm so glad there's a light switch there. I'm always turn on the light so I can get across here, even though it's just an aisle to get down there, to get down to the back. I know where I'm going, but yet it's irrational. So picture these disciples. They're sitting there doing what they know to do and struggling with all their might, and something that's totally impossible and irrational happens to them. And where do they go? It's a ghost! What? Are you serious? So they start to freak out because there's no way anybody can walk on the water. So they must be seeing things like a ghost. However, it's here where Jesus, that this figure speaks out into their fears and says, verse 20, look at verse 20. And Jesus said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. It wasn't a ghost, it was Jesus. He was there with them. In fact, Mark notes that Jesus had been watching them the whole time they were out on the sea. And this picture of Jesus walking, doing the seemingly impossible, shows us another reason why fear shouldn't control us. It shouldn't control us not only because Jesus knows what he's doing, but also because Jesus is always present. And Jesus is always present in his fullness. The idea that Jesus says, it is I. You know what this can literally be translated? Jesus calls out to them and says, do not be afraid, I am. Do you remember that saying, I am, when we were going through Exodus? And when we were going through Genesis, when God said that to Moses? Tell them the I am sent you. What is he saying? God in all of his fullness. Jesus is saying, do not be afraid. God in all of his fullness is right here with you. The God who created and sustains the universe, the God who is over all things, the God who just created food and multiplied it to feed this huge crowd, seemingly impossible, he is right here with you and present. You know why we shouldn't be controlled by fear? Because Jesus is always with us. Jesus is reminding them, I am here in all of my glory, all of this. In the most impossible way imaginable, he's walking on water, defying the laws of science. And then he works in power by calming the storm. So we have two miracles happening here. Jesus walking on the water. And then Matthew notes Peter walks on the water. Then we have Jesus calming a storm. So that's already 3 miracles happen just in this little 5-verse section. There's more coming, but we need to note this, right? Because it's important that the disciples realize that Jesus is always with them. It's important for us to know that Jesus is always with us. In fact, this is what Jesus reminds his followers, doesn't he? His last words here on earth that Matthew notes. He calls them on this important mission. This mission that will change the world through the gospel. And he tells them, go into all the world, making disciples of all nations. What a mission. That's our mission too. And it's this huge mission to do as these disciples, right? As Jesus ascends. But right before he goes, in light of this mission, I want you to know the most important thing. Usually your last words are the most important thing. And here's what he says at the end of Matthew. And behold, or lo, I am with you always, to the end of the age. I am watching over, I am present in all of my glory and all of my power. You will never be in a situation, you will never face anything that I am not bigger than. That's what Jesus is doing here by coming and walking on water to his disciples and saying, I am. Do not be afraid. Jesus is always present. Jesus is with us, so we don't need to be ruled with fear. Jesus is with us when we're at work, when we're at school, when we may feel we're all alone. Maybe we're the only Christian in our family, or we just feel all alone as standing for him. He's with us when we feel that no one understands what we're facing, or what we're facing is beyond what we can imagine or what we think we can face. Jesus is with us, and he's with us as we follow him into our world. Jesus is always with us, and he's with us in his power, which means he can rescue us in an instant. He can deliver us in an instant wherever we are. And do you know what that means? First of all, that's a great promise, isn't it? But that also means that if we're facing something and we continue to face it, and we're still walking in this trial, that means we're there for a reason, and Jesus is with us in that. So that we don't need to be fearful. Rather, we can say, wow, I wonder what Jesus is going to do with this. Because he's with us. He is present right there. That's what the psalmist says in the shepherd psalm, right? He says, even though you may be in the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. You see, we don't need to be controlled by fear because Jesus is with us. We're in a situation that we've experienced, and we don't experience rescue right away. Jesus is still there with us. So he's working. And we don't need to be fearful there. Rather, we can be hopeful, and we can say, I can't wait to see what Jesus does through this. Because he's got me. And as I said, there's more. Look at verse 21. These disciples, they respond in a great way to this. They realize it's Jesus, and it says they are glad. They were glad to take him into the boat. I love John, the king of understatement here. They were glad. They were like, yes! We got, yes! Hugging him and saying, thank you. I can't believe you did this, right? And they happily bring him aboard. They're excited. They're relieved. And again, at this point, Matthew and Mark's account, they say the wind and the waves ceased, which is another miracle, right? Yet the miracles aren't done because look how the passage ends. It says, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. They went from the middle of this lake to a beach in Capernaum instantly. I don't know how this works. But the idea that John is saying here, the trial, the lesson, what Jesus was accomplishing with his disciples is done. There's no need to keep this going now and sit around on a boat and just say, hey, we're sailing. He said, we're done. Let's get on to the next thing. And immediately, somehow, they're transported and they're at their destination. Talk about a miracle. That's amazing. And this idea, it teaches us another reason why fear shouldn't control us, not just because Jesus knows what he's doing and he's always present, but also it's this. We don't need to be controlled by fear because Jesus will take us where we should be. Jesus will always place us right where he wants us to be. So when we're following him, wherever we are is where Jesus wants us to be. Jesus got the disciples from where they were to where he wanted them to be. Immediately. It was his work. It wasn't theirs. It doesn't say when the storm ceased that the disciples continued rowing to their destination. It says immediately Jesus took them, or immediately they were right there. They didn't do anything. Jesus did that. Have you ever been afraid, that Jesus is going to take you? If I trust Jesus, what's he going to do? I don't know. I don't know if I want to trust him because what if he takes me somewhere I don't want to be? You know, I remember having these thoughts back in 2004. Debbie and I had been at a church for about 12 years, and we came to the point where we knew, and I knew God was calling us, leading us on. He had something else for me, something greater, something more significant, something more that he was preparing me for. And I knew he had it, and I knew we needed to leave that church and go to another church. And yeah, so I started looking around here because this is where we're from. And I said, so this is going to be great as long as it's around here. And I remember looking for positions at churches. I had interviews at churches where it seemed like a perfect fit, and then it would fall through, and things would happen. And then one day I got a call from a pastor about a position, and he started to share what the church was like and what they needed me to do. I'm like, this is exactly what Jesus is preparing me for, exactly where I'm going. And he goes, great. I said, where's the church? He goes, Arizona. I said, no. Sounds great, but it's Arizona. Sorry, I'm not called to Arizona. So I remember hanging up on him. And I continue looking. A month later, I get a call. It's the same pastor. He shares with me and said, man, we really want you. We've really been praying. We feel God, this is where you need to come out and visit at least. I said, it sounds great, but it's Arizona. This went on for 4 months. You see, I looked at that and I said, Arizona, wait a minute. Our family is here. Our support system is here. All that we know is here. And besides, Arizona has no ocean or fishing that's any good. So I'm like, I know God doesn't have that. Well, after 4 months, you start to realize maybe God knows what he's doing. And we got to this point where we said, all right, God, I think we're willing to trust you. And I'm going to put my faith before fear. Sure enough, we end up moving to Arizona. And let me tell you, we were in Arizona for 5 years, and it was wonderful. And God shaped us and brought us together and brought us closer to him and some amazing things. In fact, we thought this is where we're always going to be. God has placed us here in Arizona. This is where we're staying forever. And then a series of random, weird events happen. And again, there's nothing random with Jesus, is there? And through this series of events, all of a sudden, we end up back here in New Jersey at a church I had known about, that my sister and brother-in-law helped plant, that's in my hometown, no less, where God has for me to go. That's a perfect fit, but it's a perfect fit because of the way he prepared me the previous 5 years. And if I would have found that 5 years previous, it wasn't the right place. So what's the lesson there? God will always take us where he needs to put us. Are we willing to trust him? You see, Jesus can do that for all of us. He brings us to a place he wants us to be. He really wants us to trust him in that. You're here at Joy Community Fellowship today for a reason. Because Jesus wants you here. He has things for you here. He has things for you to do at your job because he has you there. He places opportunities for you to be involved in. And sometimes we don't take them because we're fearful. We're like, am I in the right place? Am I doing this? Well, I think I'm good at that, so I don't know if I want to commit to that because then I might miss out on what I think should happen. Right before us is what Jesus has for us. He places us where we should be and what we should be doing. Jesus knows, and he will take us there. That's why in Proverbs, the writer of Proverbs says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Don't be controlled by your own thoughts on this or your fear on it or getting yourself all worked up on this. He says, in all your ways acknowledge him. You know what that means? Trust him. And he'll make your path straight, or he will lead you where you need to be. There's a lot of wisdom in this statement. It was once told me by one of my mentors. He always told me, serve God where you are, and he'll place you where he wants you. But while you're here, and when you're right in the presence and in your situation you're in, serve him right where you are, and he'll move you. Just as he moved the disciples from the middle of the sea to the shores of Capernaum, he can move us. Or he will have us, he has us right where we are right now for a reason. Because it's where we should be and how we should be following him. You see, this story, it's more than just a cool story of Jesus walking on waves, walking on the water. You know, it's a lesson that teaches us that we don't need to be controlled by fear when our faith is in Jesus. Because when our faith is in Jesus, we don't need to be consumed by that because we trust that he knows what he's doing, that he is always with us, and that he's going to take us where we should be. So we can be confident to follow him right where we are. Remember, Jesus is bigger than our fears. He's bigger than any situation we will ever face, so he's bigger than any fear we can have. And we're to trust him in that. And as that trust is built, we're going to find next week, Jesus says a statement that is a game changer. You don't want to miss next week. And we're going to look at like almost 40 verses, but there's one verse that stops me in my tracks. It is a game changer in our trust in him and for following him. But it's all building to this as Jesus is ramping up his ministry and belief in him so that those who follow him may trust in him. So be encouraged by this morning. Let's pray.